No intro, no outro, just real talk. This video is going to be especially succinct because it really has no thesis and no conclusion. Currently, in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, and in most of the Pacific Northwest, illegal hard drugs have been, in effect, decriminalized. And I just had a conversation with two police officers about it at quite some length. We had two drug addicts using what was either crack cocaine, possibly fentanyl, possibly meth, but smoking a white powder in our clear view just outside of our window. And they were not in any hurry to go anywhere. And I talked it over with my girlfriend first before calling 911. I was like, well, look, we're both witnesses to this. We can both take photographs with our mobile phones. If we don't call 911, who will? Like, ethically, morally, whose responsibility is it to do something about this, if not ours right now? Like, if I don't do this, if I don't call 911, then I'm really a bit of a hypocrite if I complain that nobody does anything about the drug epidemic. But the ultimate reason to reach out and challenge authority is just to learn from those authority figures fundamentally about how the system works and why the status quo is the way it is. And that is what I learned from talking to these two police officers. So we called 911, told them the story. And again, we have two witnesses, photographs. In this case, if you actually wanted to enforce the law, this could race through the court system, right? About 15 minutes after the call to 911 was placed, two police officers showed up. And they were undercover police officers. They were in a plain black car and not wearing police uniforms. And they just came and asked these two people, these drug users, to move along, which I think also legally they didn't have to do. I mean, if you're not going to be punished for using drugs, you have every right to kind of be passed out in the park or whatever. They were in no rush to leave. I mean, they used drugs and they were enjoying lying around in the grass. In that span of time, they smoked whatever the substance was twice. You could see the puffs of white smoke. We could see everything. You could see the drug paraphernalia in action, whatever you want to say. And I went out to talk to the cops and said, hey, is nobody going to get arrested here? Is nobody actually interested in enforcing the law? And what ensued, it's exactly like the internet social justice warrior stereotypes playing out in real life. And these cops, these are some of the toughest cops in this part of Canada. These are the hard guys. They're relatively big and muscular and tattooed, incidentally, extensive tattoos in the cops. These are the guys who supposedly are out here to rough up the drug addicts as opposed to being in a softer line of work within the police department. And of course, as one of the cops said to me at length, they found me very intimidating. They found me very confrontational in asking these questions. But from my perspective, I told them this too. I said, look, I'm just here to learn. If I didn't have this conversation with you, I said this towards the end. I said, if I didn't have this conversation with you, I would not have learned that this is the way things are here. And I think I think you'll agree. I could not have learned this from reading the newspapers because the newspapers and so on are not entirely honest about this. So they began by just laughing at the notion that they would actually enforce the law and arrest someone for smoking crack cocaine, fentanyl, or meth, as the case may be. They laughed at that. They thought that was hilarious. And when they saw that I was not laughing, they went on to detail that if they had arrested these two people, the Crown would have thrown out the case. Now, in the Canadian context, the Crown just means someone at a higher level of authority than themselves. I mean, in theory, this could mean the prosecutor's office, but it might just mean someone else in the police department. In this context, I don't think the term Crown should be interpreted too narrowly. But in any case, whoever they hand the paperwork to next after arresting someone, apparently there would just be no interest in enforcing the law. And they proceeded to inform me about just how left-wing and SJW Victoria, BC, Canada was, that I must be aware that the police are already facing brutal criticism. That must be really tough. They're facing terrible criticism for being so oppressive towards the armies of homeless drug addicts living in tents on the street. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that when you signed up to be a cop, you should be protected against criticism. We're talking about laying hands on drug addicts here. It's a tough job. I completely appreciate that. But if you think a legitimate reason to not enforce the law is that there would be criticism, that is hilarious. One of these two cops was white and one of them was Asian. And he mentioned, as the conversation persisted, that he had spent some time in Taiwan. And I was like, oh, I just got back from Taiwan. I've been living in Taiwan. So that's interesting. I also, look, I speak, read, and write Chinese, which he did not react to. I'm guessing he does not speak Chinese. But, at one point early on, they said, like, what's the point of even asking us this? Like, what's the point of even asking us about the law and enforcing it and stuff? They said, yeah, that's the law, but, nobody wants us to enforce it. Like, they didn't specifically say city hall or local government. His wording was, he said, the political climate here in Victoria. Nobody wants us to enforce the law. So this wasn't naming the mayor or anything specifically responsible for this, but just the political climate and the harsh criticism they face. But I said to them, there are some countries in the world where they actually enforce the law against drugs, and they have dramatically less drug use. So the Asian guy especially got very defensive about this. I said, look, I'm going to say this to you guys real quickly because I don't want to waste your time. They're police on duty. I said, but look, I used to live in the Golden Triangle. I used to live in the world center where they produce drugs like opium, heroin, but also methamphetamine and so on. This is one of the world's great centers of drug production where hard drugs are really, really cheap. And you know what? On the streets there, you don't see a single homeless drug addict. You don't see any drug dealing because the government of China, People's Republic of China, they actually enforce the law, right? The Asian guy immediately leaps in with like, well, yeah, but they also have a lot of human rights problems. He jumps in with this. And I said, that may be true, but that's not what I was debating here. I said, it's also true that countries like Japan and Taiwan and Singapore have democracy and freedom of speech, but they enforce the law and they don't have this kind of epidemic of drug addiction. And this guy was really trying to throw me every kind of far left-wing excuse for why this isn't true. That no, he said he'd been to Taiwan, that no, these were somehow horribly oppressive governments. And, Japan has a lot of organized crime. I say, hey, you know what? I'm not claiming that there isn't a single vial of opium or heroin or cocaine in Tokyo, Japan. Of course, drugs exist everywhere. You know what I'm claiming to you? I'm claiming to you that there wouldn't be crackheads openly smoking crack cocaine in the middle of a city park in downtown Tokyo. There wouldn't be flagrant drug use from drug addicts in a public place with like 8 witnesses. That's what I'm claiming. You will never see that in Tokyo. You will never see that in Singapore. You will never see that in Taiwan. You will never see that in China. The rates of drug addiction are dramatically lower. They're not zero. And you don't have this kind of public problem. And I remember the first cop then laughed and he said, if we actually enforced the law, we would have about 200 arrests just on this street, pointing over one direction. I said, that's an interesting point. Do you actually think that's an unattainable goal for the police department? Do you actually think it would be impossible to solve the drug problem by arresting the people who are openly using fentanyl, heroin, other opioids, methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is very popular here. Crack cocaine. Arresting those people, maybe they are 200 people. It's not 2,000. It's not 20,000. The people who are flagrantly violating law on the streets. Do you actually think that's impossible or an unattainable goal? And again, they revert to saying nobody wants to do that. That's not the political climate here. I remember they specifically said to me that if I ran for government, if I tried to get elected to the mayor or city council's office, no one would vote for me because everyone supports their policy, the policy as they're enforcing it, of having de facto decriminalized hard drugs on the streets. And then they went into this cycle of like, you're being very aggressive. One of the cops said to me, I have more problems with you than I do with those two drug users. When I asked... So the problem isn't the drug addicts. The problem is someone like me who dares to come out and say, hey, is nobody actually getting arrested? Is nobody interested in enforcing the law? So look, as brief as that interchange was, I actually could offer a bunch more funny anecdotes from what the police said. The real moral of the story for you in the audience, the moral of the story is, if you don't make this little bit of an effort, if you don't take this risk, you won't learn for yourself, the structure of political authority, the anatomy of political authority, what the law means in practice where you live. And that was one of the things the cop said to me. He said, well, look, you studied political science in university, so the law and theory on paper, but this is how it is in the real world. In the real world, drugs have been completely decriminalized, apparently because the police are just too intimidated by criticism from the general public, and some kind of reluctance, which needs to be pinned down, whether it's pinned down by someone like me or by journalists or by politicians standing for office, some kind of reluctance on the part of higher authorities like the Crown, the court system, maybe it's local politicians, maybe it's provincial politicians, some kind of reluctance to actually enforce the laws as they are on the books. Let me tell you something. Whether or not there are people, in the privacy of their own apartments in Japan, very secretively smoking methamphetamine, I'm sure there are a few, all right? The difference between downtown Seattle and downtown Tokyo is striking. The difference between downtown Vancouver, yes, y'all, and hey, even downtown Nice, France. I mean, we've been to all kinds of democracies around the world that have the drug problem under control to a much better extent than this. Downtown Vancouver, compared to Yunnan, China, compared to Singapore, compared to Victoria, My daughter right now is growing up in France. If my daughter came here, if my daughter came to visit, if my daughter came to spend quality time with me, I would be ashamed and afraid to have her play in the playground that's right outside my door. And why? Because nobody wants to enforce the law. And so this park, like the whole city of the Victoria, and like the whole Pacific Northwest, Seattle and Vancouver included, it's become a playground for drug addicts and for drug addicts only. There's a very simple solution that you can see in Japan, you can see in Taiwan, you can see in Communist China, you can see in Singapore. And that is to enforce the law so that the park can be used by everyone who is willing to obey the law.